Chair, I have a few questions for the Minister around Clause 7, and we've heard just now from the Honourable Marion Street how Whanganui Iwi are getting the land back as well as the assets, i.e. the rentals. My question, though, is about what happens to the trees on that land, and who's liable if they're harvested. Who does the iwi then have to replant those trees? Do they have any liabilities under the ETS? And I bring this up because Ngāti Hine, the hapu, the iwi up north around the Bay of Islands area, they planted trees, or were convinced to plant pine trees 35 years ago in quite a significant area of land, and harvesting has since begun, and now they have real concern that because the forest isn't going to be replanted by the owners of the trees, that the liability to replant actually falls on them, because the forests were pre-1991, I think, were planted before 1991, and the liability so they have real concerns that the liability for replanting falls on them since the company is not going to replant. So that is my question for the Minister, just around Clause 7. What are the liabilities, if any, for Whanganui Iwi if the forest is harvested? Who is meant to replant, and if the replanting isn't going to happen, does the liability fall on the Whanganui Iwi? So I look forward to hearing what the Minister's response to those questions will be. Kia ora.
David Shearer.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wasn't going to take a call on this bill, but I'm sort of drawn to it because this is the first, since I've been in Parliament, this is the first time I've actually had the opportunity to speak on the settlement of a Waitangi claim, and in some ways it's quite. And, well, it's quite pertinent to that member. For a couple of years I worked for the Tainui Trust Board and worked alongside Nanai Mahuta's father at that point, Sir Robert Mahuta, and collecting the evidence on the Tainui claim, which was settled many years ago, and has meant that Tainui now has the financial and economic basis, which Sir Robert always dreamed of, to move Tainui into to give it the mana and the economic strength to go on and be not only a stronger tribe but also an economic force amongst Maori and within New Zealand. And it's an interesting case that many of these settlements now have meant that Maori ownership of their lands means that the economic base of Maori now in New Zealand is in excess of $16 billion. And coming to the part two, Mr. Chair, with regard to forestry, reminds me of just a few weeks ago I was visiting Scion in the middle of the North Island, Rotorua, which is an institution which does research around forestry. And we were looking at the potential for forests and the way that forests are able to drive many of the economic advantages that New Zealand has. But the interesting thing about Scion was suggesting that as many of our forests, our major forest enterprises, are now sold to foreign interests, and those foreign interests are more interested in chopping down trees and sending those off to Russia and China in particular, that we are not able to take advantage of the many developments that Scion was making within the area of biofuels and plastics, eco-organic plastics. One of their key developments was to look at the way that Maori forests and Maori-owned forests were being utilised so that they could fuel or at least get behind many of these economic opportunities. And the reason I bring that up, Mr. Chair, is that in part two, which relates more particularly to the forestry assets that the Ngāti Apa are going to accumulate as a result of this settlement, means that they will in fact fall within the ambit of what sign was trying to do, i.e. that the forest interests will be owned by Maori interests, and Maori interests are not going to sell them, as we have done with much of our forestry interests throughout the North Island and also in part in the South Island. So it gives me personally a great amount of pleasure to be able to stand up here and speak to this bill. The bill, as my colleagues have pointed out, it's hugely significant for the Whanganui area. It has been a source of huge grievance over many, many years, and finally some of that grievance will be able to be put to rest. I wanted also to touch upon, in part two, the crossing out, which is quite significant, I think, in many ways. It's a bold way of expressing the changes that have taken place in Whanganui, or as people from that area call them, Whanganui. The inclusion of the H in many of the words contained within this bill. And I know the Minister Williamson at the time, when he came out, kind of had a buck both ways on this and said, well, you can kind of do what you like, but he sort of hoped that the Crown and the Crown entities would in fact put the H into Whanganui, and as they are doing now. And I think slowly over time we're going to see the general pickup of the spelling throughout the Whanganui area, despite the best efforts of Michael Laws and the various people in the Whanganui area who have some sort of aversion towards it. But then many people in Taranaki had problems with the renaming of Egmont. But in part two, Mr Chair, Whanganui is replaced by Whanganui, and it's able, in a sense, to be expressed, Mr Chair.
Joe Goodhue.
Move that the question be now put.
I'll hear the Honourable Damien